Picture this. Dozens of fast attack craft. Low, fast, radar elusive, fan out across open Pacific water in a wedge formation, engines screaming, closing on the outer screen of a U.S. carrier strike group at 40+ knots. The sun is low on the horizon, cutting glare across the water in every direction, the kind of optical clutter that makes visual acquisition nearly impossible from the surface. And banking in low overhead, alone, is a single A-10 Warthog. No wingman, no escort, just the plane, the gun, and a decision that has to be made in the next few minutes. That image raises an immediate question worth taking seriously. Is a Cold War-era tank destroyer, originally built to shred Soviet armor on the German plains, actually the right tool to break up a maritime swarm? Or is the real answer already waiting on the destroyer's deck, in the chain gun mount and the fire control radar that never blinked? Here's where this goes. We're walking through the mechanics of this engagement from the first radar contact to the moment the swarm either breaks or closes. Minute by minute, system by system. The answer isn't what most people expect. And the reason comes down to a number most viewers never think about: how many rounds the GA-U-8 Avenger actually carries versus how many boats are in the water. Stay with us. To understand why this scenario matters, you have to understand what a fast attack craft swarm is actually trying to do, and why the US Navy takes it seriously enough to wargame it constantly. Fast attack craft are cheap. A capable armed speedboat, 40 to 60 feet, carrying anti-ship rockets or heavy machine guns, hitting 45 knots in open water, costs somewhere between $1 and $5 million to build and operate. Compare that to the replacement cost of a single Arleigh Burke class destroyer, which runs north of $2 billion. That exchange ratio is the entire strategic logic of the swarm. You don't need to sink the carrier. You don't need to sink the destroyer. You need to overwhelm the defense by presenting more targets than it can service, fast enough that the expensive ships can't maneuver clear. The tactic isn't new. Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats ran versions of it in the Persian Gulf for decades. In the late 1980s, Operation Praying Mantis gave the US Navy direct experience with exactly this kind of surface threat. Small, fast, heavily armed craft operating in contested littoral space, using geography and civilian traffic density to complicate targeting. The lessons from that engagement shaped decades of surface warfare doctrine. But the open Pacific presents a different geometry: bigger distances, deeper water, and a carrier strike group that has time and space to work with if the sensors are on and the coordination is tight. The Persian Gulf scenario is a close-range knife fight. The Pacific scenario is a long-range calculation that only becomes a knife fight if the outer layers fail. A swarm of 20 to 40 fast attack craft spreading across a 15-mile frontage creates a detection and engagement problem no single system was designed to solve alone. The boats are small, low radar cross-section, low heat signature, hard to distinguish from civilian traffic at range. They move fast. They may be running emissions control. No active radar, no radio transmissions to light them up on the strike group's electronic warfare picture. At 15 miles in daylight with some sea state running, a fast attack craft presents a radar cross-section comparable to a large wave return. At night, that problem gets harder. The closer they get to the carrier, the more the geometry compresses. Angles tighten, reaction windows shrink, and the cost of a miss goes up with every passing second. The crews of these boats know something important about the defense they're running against. The SPY 1D radar on an Arleigh Burke is one of the most capable air search systems in the world. Against a surface target at sea level, with wave clutter masking the return, it is considerably less decisive. The swarm exploits a seam in the architecture. Not a gap in capability exactly, but a regime where performance is measurably degraded relative to its primary design envelope. That's the threat. Now let's put the A-10 in the picture and ask, honestly, what does it actually bring to this fight? The A-10 Warthog, officially the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, was designed around a single weapon, the GA-U-8 Avenger rotary cannon. 7 barrels, 30 mm depleted uranium rounds, firing at up to 3,900 rounds per minute in combat bursts. The gun is so physically large and mechanically dominant that the airframe was essentially built around it. The nose gear is offset to one side, so the cannon barrel sits precisely on the aircraft's centerline. When the GA-U-8 fires, the recoil force equals roughly the thrust output of one of the 2 turbofan engines. The ammunition drum alone, fully loaded, weighs close to 4,000 pounds. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful aircraft-mounted guns ever fielded. Against Soviet tanks in Central Europe, it was devastating. The PGU-14 armor-piercing incendiary round uses a depleted uranium penetrator that can defeat the top armor of most Soviet-era main battle tanks at combat ranges. Against fast boats on open water, the physics are actually favorable. A 30mm round that glances off the sloped armor of a main battle tank will go straight through the hull of a fiberglass or aluminum speedboat. The Warthog doesn't need to hit an engine block or a crew compartment. It needs rounds into the waterline. A burst that walks up the length of a 40-foot attack boat will typically rupture the hull below the waterline in multiple places, detonate exposed fuel or ordnance, and leave a craft taking on water faster than it can maneuver. Mission kill. Not instantly, but decisively. So the gun is lethal against this target. The question is the geometry of employment. And this is where the real conversation starts. Here's the complication that recasts everything. A standard A-10 combat load carries 1,174 rounds for the GAU-8. In actual strafing practice, pilots fire in short bursts. 1 to 2 seconds, roughly 65 to 130 rounds per trigger pull. A clean strafing pass on a moving boat, accounting for lead angle and dispersion at low-level flight, the pilot pulling out of a shallow dive at approximately 300 feet to avoid ingesting debris and water spray might expend 150 to 250 rounds to achieve a mission kill on a single target. On a full combat load, a single A-10 gets somewhere between 5 and 8 effective passes before the gun runs dry. 5 to 8 passes. Against a swarm of 30 boats. That's the math that changes the conversation. The A-10 can hurt the swarm, meaningfully and dramatically. But it cannot break the swarm alone. Not with one jet. Not with that ammunition load. What it can do, and this is actually significant, is disrupt the formation, scatter the trailing edge, force the lead boats to take evasive action, and buy time. Time is the currency the rest of the fleet needs. What's most surprising about this scenario isn't that the A-10 runs out of ammunition. It's how quickly that constraint becomes operationally decisive. If the pilot expends conservatively, 2 passes per target, prioritizing lead elements, the gun is empty before the swarm is half serviced. If the pilot fires aggressively, accepting 1 pass per target and some proportion of misses, the math improves marginally, but doesn't fundamentally change the picture. There is no firing discipline that makes 1,174 rounds sufficient to engage 30 boats to destruction. The arithmetic is fixed. So let's build the actual picture of how this engagement unfolds. The A-10 doesn't show up in a vacuum. It shows up as one layer in a system, and understanding the layers is the whole point. It starts overhead, where nobody sees it from the water. An MQ-9 Reaper, 42-foot unmanned surveillance and strike aircraft, cruising at altitude on a racetrack orbit, has been watching the area of interest for hours. The MQ-9 carries a multispectral targeting system capable of tracking dozens of individual surface contacts simultaneously, streaming real-time video and radar returns via satellite data link. The sensor package can see heat signatures from engines, distinguish powered craft from anchored vessels, and zoom to identify individual boat types at altitude. When the fast attack craft begin forming up, engines hot, course set, formation tightening, the Reaper sees it first. The MQ-9 sensor operator, potentially thousands of miles away at a ground control station in Nevada or California, calls the contact and pipes the feed directly into the carrier strike group's cooperative engagement capability network. Within seconds, the Arleigh Burke destroyer on the outer Picket is looking at the same picture the Reaper is looking at. The Combat Information Center assigns tracks, calculates closing speed, at 40 knots over a 20-mile approach, approximately 30 minutes, and begins queuing engagement solutions. 30 minutes sounds like a long time. It isn't. Not when you're sequencing multiple layers of defense, coordinating with aircraft overhead, managing rules of engagement confirmation, and trying to sort armed fast attack craft from the civilian traffic that may be in the same water. A busy commercial shipping lane in the Western Pacific can have hundreds of vessels within radar range at any given moment. Positively identifying which contacts are the threat and which are fishing boats or cargo vessels on normal routes is not instant, not automatic, and not consequence-free if you get it wrong. That procedural friction, the time it takes humans in a chain of command to authorize lethal force against an ambiguous surface contact, is the adversary's best friend. The swarm tactic is partly a bureaucratic weapon. Present enough contacts fast enough, and the decision cycle breaks down before the engagement cycle can respond. The strike group commander is weighing positive identification, rules of engagement authority, risk of collateral damage to civilian vessels, and diplomatic consequences of a wrong call. All in real time, while the closing speed clock runs. Put yourself in the destroyer's Combat Information Center for a second. 30-plus tracks inbound, closing at 40 knots, spread across a 15-mile front. The watch officer has just passed ROE confirmation up the chain. You have positive weapon release authority from the strike group commander. You have the MQ-9 feed on one screen and your SPY-1D radar track picture on another. The tactical action officer is calling targets for the Seahawks on the flight deck. The first boats are now inside 20 miles. What do you engage first? The doctrine answer is lead elements first, densest cluster second. You want to force the formation to react, to turn, to slow, to spread, before it compresses inside your minimum engagement envelope. Every boat that breaks off its attack course is a target that no longer requires a Hellfire to defeat. But picking the right lead elements, while simultaneously managing the Seahawk launch, while simultaneously talking the A-10 pilot onto targets with a verbal description of a track picture the pilot can only partially see on his cockpit data link display. That is not a clean, sequential process. It is simultaneous, overlapping, and demanding in a way that tabletop exercises only partially capture. The Arleigh Burke class destroyer, specifically the Mark 38 machine gun system, a 25mm chain gun mounted on deck, engages surface targets at effective ranges out to approximately 2,700 meters. That's a hard kill layer, but a close-in layer. The Mark 38 is not designed to engage a swarm at 10 miles. It's designed to engage the boats that get through everything else. The destroyer's primary medium-range surface engagement option against fast craft is a combination of embarked helicopters and the ship's own deck weapons. An MH-60R Seahawk, the Arleigh Burke standard embarked rotary wing, carries Hellfire missiles and a door gun, can respond in minutes, and is far more flexible against a dispersed surface threat than any fixed gun mount. Two Seahawks launching simultaneously from the destroyer's flight deck can begin engaging lead boats at 5 to 6 miles while the ship itself holds its Mark 38 in reserve for close-in work. What often gets lost in discussions of the Seahawk's role here is the crew workload aboard that helicopter. The MH-60R carries a crew of 4: pilot, co-pilot, tactical systems operator, and sensor operator. In a surface engagement against fast-moving targets in sea clutter, the sensor operator is manually queuing the targeting system, the tactical systems officer is managing the weapon release sequence, and the pilots are managing terrain clearance, threat avoidance, and fuel state simultaneously. It is an extraordinarily capable platform, but it is 4 people in a helicopter executing a precision strike against a target doing 45 knots in open water, and the cognitive demand is real and finite. This is where the A-10 fits, not as the primary engagement system, but as the medium-range disruption layer that the Seahawks and the ship's guns can't cover alone. The A-10 arrives on station while the swarm is still 8 to 12 miles out. The pilot has the Reaper's track picture data linked to the cockpit. Not a perfect picture, but enough to identify the densest cluster and the lead elements. The pilot rolls in from altitude, descending through 4,000 feet in a shallow dive, airspeed building toward 350 knots, the low-altitude safety and targeting enhancement system. Elasti, computing an attack geometry solution that accounts for target motion, wind, aircraft velocity vector, and slant range simultaneously. The reticle settles. The thumb moves to the trigger on the control stick. The first strafing pass targets the geometric center of the formation, not to destroy every boat on the first pass, but to force evasive action across the entire swarm simultaneously. Here's what that does. A swarm's effectiveness depends on maintaining formation coherence. Boats need to stay at roughly the right intervals from each other to present a coordinated targeting problem. When the GAU-8 opens up on the formation center, the boats that aren't hit see the water erupt around them. The rounds hit the surface at shallow angles, kicking up columns of spray 6 to 8 feet high in a line that walks across the water at a rate visible to every crew in the formation. There is nothing subtle about it. The flat crack of supersonic 30mm rounds striking the surface carries across open water. Every boat driver in that swarm is now making an individual survival decision, and individual survival decisions are the enemy of formation coherence. Boats brake right and left. Throttles pull back as drivers instinctively react to incoming fire. The tight wedge degrades into a dispersed scatter. Some turn back. Some accelerate toward the carrier on their own. The formation that was presenting a coordinated saturation problem is now a collection of individual problems. And individual problems are exactly what the layered defense was designed to handle. But here's the layer this scenario keeps returning to, the one that actually carries the weight of the defense. If the A-10 can only service 5 to 8 boats before the gun is empty, and the Seahawks are managing 2 or 3 targets at a time with Hellfires, and the Mark 38 is holding the 500-meter perimeter, who handles boats 11 through 30. The engagement has to be sequential and simultaneous. The Reaper feeds updated track positions continuously. The destroyer's combat system assigns priority targets automatically based on closing speed and bearing to the carrier, recalculating the threat queue every few seconds as the picture evolves. The Seahawks work the lead elements. The A-10 works the dense cluster. The Mark 38 engages anything that gets to knife fighting range. And the strike group's other surface assets, there may be a second Arleigh Burke or a Ticonderoga-class cruiser on the outer screen, are also engaging with their own Seahawks and deck weapons. The strike group is not a single ship fighting alone. It is a network of sensors and shooters sharing a common tactical picture and coordinating fires across that picture in near real time. The Cooperative Engagement Capability System, CEC, allows every shooter in the network to use targeting data from every sensor in the network, including the Reaper overhead. A Seahawk launching a Hellfire at a boat 12 miles from the destroyer doesn't need its own radar lock on that boat. It can shoot on a track generated by the destroyer's combat system, refined by the Reaper's electro-optical feed. That sensor fusion is the actual force multiplier in this scenario, not any single weapon system. Here's the honest caveat, stated plainly. A sufficiently large swarm, launched with enough boats simultaneously across a wide enough frontage, can saturate this system. The math is not infinitely favorable to the defense. If you put 70 boats into the water across a 30-mile front, you are presenting a threat that requires more than one destroyer, more than one A-10, and more than 2 Seahawks to engage decisively. The defense handles 20 to 30 boats well. Against 70, the margins compress. Here's the take that'll probably generate some pushback. The A-10's actual contribution in this scenario is psychological more than kinetic. The GAU-8 does real damage, but the sound of a 30mm rotary cannon opening up at low altitude, the visual of the water surface disintegrating in a line of geysers, the certainty that the plane overhead can put rounds anywhere in the formation within seconds, that breaks formation discipline in a way that a missile launched from 12 miles away does not. Missiles arrive unseen. The A-10 arrives seen, heard, and understood. There is a deterrent value in the visible, audible, close proximity presence of a gun aircraft that doesn't translate neatly into a kinetic spreadsheet. The psychological literature on suppressive fire is reasonably clear. Humans under direct visual and auditory fire stimulus make degraded decisions, even when they are not physically hit. The A-10 generates that stimulus across the entire swarm simultaneously in a way no standoff weapon can replicate. Now let's talk about what this engagement actually cost, because the cost picture is part of the strategic calculation the swarm tactic is trying to exploit. Each fast attack boat in this scenario costs somewhere between $1 and $5 million. The Hellfire missiles the Seahawks expend run approximately $115,000 each. The 30mm rounds from the GAU-8 cost roughly $30 apiece, which makes the GAU-8 economically the most favorable weapon in the engagement by a significant margin. A 2-second burst of 130 rounds costs approximately $4,000 and can achieve a mission kill on a target that costs $2 million to build and deploy. That is a favorable cost exchange for the defense. The problem is the total cost of operating the systems that deliver those rounds. An A-10 Warthog's flight hour cost runs approximately $19,000. An MQ-9 Reaper orbit costs approximately $3,400 per flight hour. An MH-60R Seahawk runs approximately $15,000 per flight hour. The destroyers burning fuel at high-speed intercept courses are consuming tens of thousands of dollars per hour in fuel alone. And those operating costs are continuous. The Reaper may have been on orbit for 18 hours before the swarm even formed up. The cost of the engagement doesn't begin when the first trigger is pulled. It begins the moment the surveillance architecture goes up to watch for the threat. The swarm's economic logic isn't that each individual boat is cost competitive with a Hellfire. It's that forcing the entire strike group into a high-tempo defensive posture, burning flight hours, expending missiles, degrading maintenance cycles, accelerating hull wear on ships running at elevated speed, imposes a cumulative cost that a peer adversary can sustain far more cheaply than the US Navy can respond to. If the adversary runs 3 or 4 swarm probes over weeks, each one not necessarily a serious attempt to close the carrier, but serious enough to require a full defensive response, the attrition on the strike group's ready magazine and aircraft availability is real and compounding. This is sometimes called a magazine depth problem, and it is one of the most actively discussed challenges in current surface warfare planning. One detail that sticks with me going through the tactical literature on this: the constraint isn't usually the missiles or the gun rounds. It's the Seahawk. 2 embarked helicopters on an Arleigh Burke represent a finite sorties per day ceiling that a determined swarm operator can calculate in advance. Helicopter availability is driven by maintenance cycles, crew rest requirements, airframe hours between inspections, and parts availability at sea, none of which the strike group can simply will away under operational pressure. If the swarm accepts that some boats won't survive the outer engagement layers and still has enough hulls to close the remaining distance, the terminal defense problem falls entirely on the Mark 38 and whatever deck weapons the crew can bring to bear. That is a scenario the Navy has clearly wargamed extensively. And it's why the Mark 38 upgrades, the laser weapon systems under development, and the growing interest in directed energy deck-mounted systems all make operational sense. There's another piece of the cost picture that doesn't get discussed enough in popular coverage: logistics. An Arleigh Burke operating in the Western Pacific is not adjacent to a naval station with a full magazine resupply on short notice. The vertical launch system cells containing SM-2 and SM-6 missiles primarily designed for air defense are not designed to be reloaded at sea. Once they're expended, the destroyer has to transit to a port with reload facilities. A journey that may take days and removes that hull from the strike group's outer screen for the duration. The swarm operator, who understands this logistical reality, isn't trying to destroy the destroyer. They're trying to drain the magazine deeply enough that the destroyer becomes a progressively less capable piece of the layered defense. Over a sustained campaign, that's a viable strategy. Here's what this tells us about where naval defense is actually heading: the layered architecture. Reaper overhead, Seahawk at medium range, a -10 as disruption top cover, Mark 38 at close-in. Works against the swarm size as current doctrine assumes. It works well. The coordination between the MQ-9 sensor feed and the destroyer's combat system is genuinely impressive, and the ability to track and prioritize 30-plus surface contacts simultaneously while managing airspace for multiple aircraft represents a level of integration no peer adversary has yet matched in practice. But the architecture is not infinitely scalable against mass. That's not a criticism. It's physics and economics. The Navy knows this. It's why the directed energy programs matter. A laser weapon system that can engage a fast boat for a cost measured in dollars per shot rather than thousands per missile changes the cost exchange math the swarm tactic depends on. The Laser Weapon System Demonstrator, LWSD, has already deployed aboard USS Portland and demonstrated engagement of small surface targets at sea. The next-generation high-energy laser with integrated optical dazzler and surveillance system, Helios, is being installed on Arleigh Burke destroyers now. These systems are not hypothetical. They are in the water. When that capability reaches fleet-wide deployment, the swarm's economic logic collapses. You can't sustain an attrition strategy against a defense that costs less per intercept than your boats cost to build. The transition from a missile primary to an energy weapon supplemented defense architecture is not complete. We are somewhere in the middle of it, past the proof of concept phase, not yet at the point where a fleet commander can confidently assume that every destroyer on the outer picket carries an effectively unlimited magazine against small surface targets. The A-10 fills part of that gap. The Mark 38 fills another part. The Seahawk fills a third. None of them alone is sufficient. Together, integrated through the common sensor picture the Reaper and the CEC network provide, they constitute a defense that works against the threat as it exists today in the swarm sizes current adversary doctrine envisions. The A-10 in this scenario is, in some ways, a bridge technology, filling a coverage gap that exists right now, in this decade, before directed energy reaches operational maturity. It's not the permanent answer. It's an honest, effective, somewhat improbable-seeming solution to a real problem, deployed by a force that knows how to use every tool in the kit. The Warthog was never supposed to be a naval asset. It was never designed for maritime operations. Its use here reflects something real about integrated joint operations, the willingness to put the right effect on the right target regardless of whether the platform delivering that effect was designed with the scenario in mind. That's the picture. A single A-10 Warthog cannot break a fastboat swarm by itself, but integrated into a layered detection and engagement architecture anchored by an MQ-9 Reaper overhead and an Arleigh Burke on the outer picket, it can disrupt formation coherence, degrade saturation timing, and buy the space the Seahawks and the Mark 38 need to close the engagement. The gun doesn't have to win the fight. It has to buy the minutes the rest of the system needs to win the fight. Team A-10 or Team Seahawk? Which platform do you think actually carries the weight of this defense? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one. And if you want to see how the Arleigh Burke's Aegis system handles the next layer of this problem, what happens when the fast boats are just the lead element and the anti-ship missiles come in behind them? That breakdown is already up. It's a different kind of math, and the margins are tighter than you'd expect.